My name is Marcus Chen, and I'm the compliance officer who brought down my corrupt boss and saved my company from a federal investigation. It started when David asked me to bury a safety violation that could have killed workers. When I refused, he fired me. When the FBI heard my recordings, he got fired permanently. I worked for West Coast Manufacturing in San Diego, a mid-sized company that produced industrial chemicals for construction and agriculture. As senior compliance officer, my job was to ensure we followed all federal safety, environmental, and labor regulations. It was a good job with decent pay, excellent benefits, and the satisfaction of knowing I was protecting both our workers and the public from dangerous practices. I'd been there for 8 years, working my way up from junior inspector to senior compliance officer. My boss, David Reeves, was vice president of operations. He'd been with the company for 15 years and had a reputation for getting results. What I didn't realize when I took the job was that David's results sometimes came at the expense of following the law. The first red flag came 6 months after David became my direct supervisor. We'd discovered elevated benzene levels in one of our storage areas, levels that exceeded OSHA safety standards and put our workers at risk of serious health problems. My report recommended immediate remediation, temporary shutdown of the affected area, and notification of regulatory authorities as required by law. David called me into his office to discuss my findings. "Marcus, this benzene issue," he said, closing the door behind us. "I need you to reconsider your recommendations." "What do you mean?" "The shutdown you're recommending would cost us $200,000 in lost production, plus the remediation costs, plus potential fines from OSHA. We're talking about $500,000. "David, the benzene levels are 3 times the legal limit. We can't expose our workers to that." "Look, I understand your concerns, but let's be practical. No one's gotten sick yet. Maybe we could just adjust the numbers slightly. Bring them down to acceptable levels on paper while we work on a gradual solution." I stared at him. "You're asking me to falsify a safety report?" "I'm asking you to be creative in your interpretation of the data." That conversation made me realize David's priorities were profit first, safety second, and legal compliance a distant third. I refused to alter the benzene report, but David found ways to delay implementing my recommendations. "We need more data," he'd say. "Let's wait for next month's readings before making any drastic changes." Meanwhile, our workers continued to be exposed to dangerous levels of benzene every day. Over the next few months, similar situations arose. A wastewater discharge that exceeded EPA limits, safety equipment that hadn't been properly maintained, workers handling hazardous materials without adequate protective gear. Each time, David would call me into his office and suggest ways to minimize the problem on paper rather than actually fixing it. "Marcus, you need to understand the big picture," he'd say. "Yes, we want to follow regulations, but we also need to keep this company profitable. Sometimes that means being flexible in how we interpret the rules." Flexible. That was David's word for illegal. I started documenting everything. Every conversation, every request to alter reports, every time David told me to ignore safety violations. I kept detailed notes with dates, times, and exact quotes. But I also started doing something else. Recording our conversations. California is a 2-party consent state, which means both parties must agree to being recorded. But there's an exception for recording conversations when you have reasonable belief that illegal activity is being discussed. David's requests to falsify federal safety and environmental reports definitely qualified as illegal activity. I used a small digital recorder that I kept in my shirt pocket during meetings with David. The audio quality was excellent, and David never suspected he was being recorded. The situation reached a crisis point when we had a minor chemical spill in our main production facility. No one was injured, but federal regulations required immediate reporting to the EPA and implementation of specific cleanup procedures. My incident report detailed exactly what had happened, how much chemical was spilled, and what steps we needed to take to prevent future incidents. David was furious when he read it. "Marcus, this report is going to trigger a full EPA inspection. Do you understand what that means?" "It means we follow the law and cooperate with investigators. It means they'll find every minor violation we've been working to correct. It means massive fines, potential criminal charges, and possibly shutting down operations entirely." "Then maybe we should have been following regulations more carefully." David's face turned red. "I'm not going to let your by-the-book attitude destroy this company. You need to revise this report." "How?" "Minimize the spill amount. Change the chemical classification. Make it sound like a minor maintenance issue rather than a reportable incident." "That's federal fraud, David. We're talking about criminal charges if we get caught." "We won't get caught if you do your job properly." That's when I realized David saw breaking federal law as part of my job description. "I won't falsify federal reports," I said clearly. "Then maybe you're not the right person for this position." The next morning, David called me into his office along with Patricia Williams, our HR director. "Marcus, we need to discuss your performance," David began. Patricia looked uncomfortable, like she'd rather be anywhere else. "Over the past several months, you've shown a pattern of insubordination and failure to follow management directives," David continued. "You've refused to implement cost-effective solutions to operational challenges, and you've shown poor judgment in your regulatory interpretations." I knew where this was heading. David was building a paper trail to justify firing me for refusing to break the law. "What specifically are you referring to?" I asked. "The benzene situation. You recommended an expensive shutdown when a more measured approach would have been appropriate. The wastewater issue. You insisted on expensive remediation when minor adjustments would have brought us into compliance. The recent chemical spill report. You've created unnecessary regulatory exposure for the company. I've followed federal safety and environmental regulations exactly as written." That's the problem, Marcus. Sometimes regulations need to be interpreted in context. Sometimes the spirit of the law is more important than the letter of the law. Patricia shifted in her seat. She was clearly uncomfortable with David's euphemisms for breaking federal law. "I need you to understand something," David continued. "Your job is to help this company succeed while managing regulatory requirements. If you can't balance those priorities, then perhaps you're not suited for this role. Are you asking me to falsify reports? I'm asking you to be reasonable in your compliance recommendations." That's not an answer. David leaned forward. "Let me be clearer. I need you to revise the chemical spill report to minimize our regulatory exposure. I need you to reconsider your benzene recommendations to reduce implementation costs. And I need you to adopt a more flexible approach to environmental and safety compliance going forward. And if I refuse? Then we'll need to discuss whether this position is a good fit for your rigid interpretation of regulations." I looked at Patricia, who was studying her hands and avoiding eye contact. "I need to think about this," I said. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide," David replied. That night, I reviewed all the recordings I'd made over the past 6 months. David's voice was crystal clear on every recording, explicitly asking me to falsify federal reports, ignore safety violations, and cover up environmental violations. I also researched whistleblower protections under federal law. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act, the Clean Air Act, and the Safe Drinking Water Act all have provisions protecting employees who report violations of environmental and safety regulations. More importantly, these laws provide for significant financial rewards for whistleblowers whose information leads to successful government enforcement actions. I made my decision. The next morning, I walked into David's office with my final answer. "I won't falsify reports or ignore safety violations," I said clearly. "If that makes me unsuitable for this position, then I guess this position is unsuitable for me." David smiled coldly. "I was hoping you'd be more reasonable, but I understand your position. Patricia, please prepare Mr. Chen's termination paperwork." "What grounds?" Patricia asked. "Insubordination, failure to follow management directives, poor performance in regulatory compliance management." Patricia looked skeptical, but she nodded. "You'll have 2 weeks severance and continuation of health benefits for 30 days, David told me. "Security will escort you out after you pack your personal items." As I packed my desk, David watched from his office doorway. "You know, Marcus," he called out, "maybe next time you'll think twice before questioning authority. Sometimes being right isn't as important as being employed." I looked at him and smiled. Sometimes being employed isn't as important as being able to sleep at night. What David didn't know was that the digital recorder in my shirt pocket had just captured his admission that he was firing me for refusing to break federal law. I drove straight from West Coast Manufacturing to the offices of Morrison & Associates, a law firm that specialized in whistleblower cases. Attorney Jennifer Morrison listened to my recordings for 2 hours, occasionally stopping to take notes or ask clarification questions. "Marcus, what you have here is extremely valuable," she said finally. "Clear evidence of management directing employees to violate federal environmental and safety regulations, plus retaliation against an employee who refused to participate. What are my options?" "Several. We can file complaints with OSHA, the EPA, and the Department of Labor. We can also contact the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, since falsifying federal reports is a felony." "What about my job?" "Whistleblower laws provide for reinstatement with back pay, plus financial rewards if the government recovers penalties from the company. But Marcus, you need to understand, this process can take years, and it will likely destroy your relationship with your former employer permanently. I thought about the workers still being exposed to dangerous benzene levels. I thought about the environmental violations that could affect the entire community. I thought about David's arrogant assumption that threatening my job would make me compromise my principles." "Let's file everything," I said. Jennifer drafted complaints to multiple federal agencies, each supported by detailed documentation and audio recordings of David's illegal requests. Within a week, I received calls from investigators at OSHA, the EPA, and the FBI. Special Agent Rodriguez from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Unit was particularly interested in my recordings. "Mr. Chen, these recordings clearly show systematic violations of federal environmental and safety laws, plus conspiracy to commit fraud by falsifying federal reports. This is exactly the kind of case we prioritize. What happens now? We investigate. We'll interview other employees, review company records, and document the full scope of violations. If the evidence supports criminal charges, we'll present the case to federal prosecutors. 3 months after I was fired, federal agents raided West Coast manufacturing. I watched the news coverage from my apartment, seeing FBI agents carrying boxes of documents out of the building where I'd worked for 8 years. The local news reported that the raid was part of an ongoing investigation into environmental and safety violations at the facility. David's picture appeared on screen as reporters described him as a person of interest in the federal investigation. My phone rang. It was Jennifer Morrison. "Marcus, turn on Channel 7. They're doing a live report from your old company." I was already watching. The reporter was standing outside the main gate as FBI agents continued to carry evidence out of the building. Sources tell us this investigation began with information provided by a former employee who had been terminated earlier this year, the reporter said. The next day, the San Diego Union Tribune ran a front-page story about the investigation. The headline read, "Federal Agents Raid Chemical Plant in Environmental Crime Probe." The article detailed allegations of falsified safety reports, ignored environmental violations, and retaliation against whistleblowers. David was quoted as saying the company was cooperating fully with investigators, and that any violations were minor technical issues that are being addressed. But the federal investigation was just beginning. Over the next 6 months, investigators discovered that David's illegal practices went far beyond what I had witnessed. They found evidence of systematic falsification of environmental monitoring reports going back 5 years, improper disposal of hazardous waste that had contaminated groundwater, safety violations that had resulted in unreported worker injuries, bribes paid to local inspectors to overlook violations, tax fraud related to environmental cleanup costs that were never actually incurred. The scope of David's criminal enterprise was staggering. David was arrested at his home on a Tuesday morning. The charges included conspiracy, environmental crimes, wire fraud, tax fraud, and obstruction of justice. The local news showed him being led away in handcuffs, his face hidden behind a jacket. But David wasn't the only one facing consequences. The company's CEO, Thomas Mitchell, was also charged with conspiracy and failure to report environmental violations. It turned out that Mitchell had known about David's practices and had chosen to look the other way because they were saving the company money. Patricia Williams, the HR director, cooperated with investigators in exchange for immunity. She provided evidence that David had explicitly instructed her to fire me for refusing to be more flexible with regulatory compliance. The company itself faced massive penalties. The EPA levied $2.3 million in fines for environmental violations. OSHA assessed $890,000 in penalties for safety violations. The IRS demanded $1.1 million in back taxes and penalties for fraudulent deductions. Total government penalties exceeded $4.2 million, not including the costs of environmental remediation and victim compensation. But the real consequences went beyond money. 3 workers had developed health problems from benzene exposure that could have been prevented if David had implemented my safety recommendations. They sued the company for medical expenses and damages. The contaminated groundwater affected 17 residential properties near the plant. Those families also sued for property damage and health concerns. West Coast Manufacturing's reputation was destroyed. Major customers canceled contracts, suppliers demanded cash payments, and the company's insurance was canceled. Within 18 months of my firing, West Coast Manufacturing filed for bankruptcy. David's trial began 2 years after I was fired. I was the star witness for the prosecution, and my recordings were the centerpiece of their case. The courtroom was packed as prosecutors played audio of David explicitly directing me to falsify federal reports. "Just change the numbers." David's voice echoed through the courtroom. "No one will ever know." "That's federal fraud, David," my voice responded on the recording. "We're talking about criminal charges if we get caught." "We won't get caught if you do your job properly." The jury listened in silence as recording after recording demonstrated David's systematic approach to breaking federal law. David's defense attorney tried to argue that his client was under pressure from corporate management to reduce costs, that he had never intended to break the law, that his requests were misunderstood. But the recordings were unambiguous. David's voice was clear on every tape, explicitly asking me to falsify reports, ignore violations, and cover up environmental crimes. The prosecution also presented evidence of David's lavish lifestyle, funded in part by bonuses he received for keeping regulatory costs low. While workers were being exposed to dangerous chemicals, David was buying a new BMW and taking expensive vacations paid for with money that should have been spent on safety equipment. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts, David was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $1.2 million in restitution to workers and affected communities. CEO Thomas Mitchell received 5 years and $800,000 in restitution. Under federal whistleblower laws, I was entitled to reinstatement with back pay, plus a percentage of the penalties recovered by the government. Since West Coast Manufacturing was bankrupt, reinstatement wasn't possible. But I received full back pay for the time I was unemployed, plus a whistleblower award of $420,000, 10% of the government penalties. More importantly, the case established important precedents for environmental and safety whistleblowers. My recordings demonstrated how to document illegal activities, and the successful prosecution showed that corporate executives would face serious consequences for retaliating against employees who refused to break the law. I used my whistleblower award to start my own environmental consulting firm, helping companies develop legitimate compliance programs that protect workers and communities without breaking the law. Many of my clients are companies that want to avoid the fate of West Coast Manufacturing. They've seen what happens when profits are prioritized over legal compliance. I also work with other potential whistleblowers, helping them document violations and understand their legal protections. The key, I tell them, is to be thorough in your documentation and clear about your legal obligations. When someone asks you to break the law, make sure you understand exactly what they're asking and why you're refusing. 3 years after David fired me for insubordination, I received a letter from him in federal prison. "Marcus," he wrote, "I've had a lot of time to think about what happened. I want you to know that I understand why you did what you did. I was wrong to ask you to compromise your principles, and I'm sorry for the position I put you in. It was too little, too late, but it was something." The workers who had been exposed to benzene received medical monitoring and treatment funded by the court-ordered restitution. The families affected by groundwater contamination received compensation for their damages. Most importantly, the new owners of the manufacturing facility, purchased out of bankruptcy by a company with strong environmental values, implemented comprehensive safety and environmental programs that protect both workers and the community. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you your job. But sometimes losing your job is the price of keeping your integrity. David thought he could pressure me into breaking federal law by threatening my livelihood. He thought my need for employment would overcome my commitment to protecting workers and communities. He was wrong. My name is Marcus Chen, and I'm the compliance officer who chose principle over paycheck and integrity over income. When my boss fired me for refusing to falsify reports, he thought he was eliminating a problem. Instead, he was creating the evidence that would destroy his career and save countless lives. Sometimes the most important thing you can do at work is refuse to do your job. When that job involves breaking the law, endangering workers, or harming communities. The recordings that cost me my job ultimately saved my industry from a corrupt executive who saw federal law as an optional guideline rather than a mandatory requirement. Justice isn't always swift, but it's often thorough. David learned that lesson from a federal prison cell. Marcus's story demonstrates the importance of environmental and safety whistleblowers in protecting workers and communities from corporate greed. By documenting illegal requests and refusing to compromise his principles, Marcus not only protected himself legally, but helped expose a systematic pattern of environmental crimes. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is lose your job to save lives.